Welcome to training presentation for Standard 2. My name is Roman Plechenko. I'm Assurance Manager at SBP and I will guide you through the Standard 2 version 2. I expect you have completed the previous module about Standard 1 as it is crucial for understanding how Standard 2 works. In this session we will give you a detailed overview of the Standard 2, its purpose and content. We will link it to the guidance document and focus on indicators that are new or revised and might require more time to implement. Let's dive in. Standard 2 is probably the core standard in the whole framework, so to say scheme's engine. SBP certification scheme applies a risk-based approach. Biomass producers assess the risk of non-compliance against the principles and criteria of Standard 1 when deciding which feedstock to source for biomass production. Using Standard 2, biomass producers identify, evaluate, and adequately mitigate the risks of sourcing feedstock for the purposes of biomass production that does not comply with the criteria set in Standard 1. Risks are rated as low or specified. Organizations need to ensure that all specified risks are managed and reduced to low level or otherwise excluded from the supply base. Organizations gain certification against Standard 2 by complying with the requirements set in Standard 1 and demonstrating that they have adequately reduced the risk of sourcing feedstock that is not compliant with Standard 1. But there are also special requirements for processing residues and post-consumer feedstocks. In the next slides, we will study all requirements of Standard 2 in details. As we already mentioned for Standard 1, publication date was 10th of May 2023. The effective date is 3 months later and the transition period is 15 months. In this slide, we will discuss the key components of Standard 2, which is focused on risk management and ensuring the sustainability of biomass supply. Standard outlines the necessary steps for organizations to properly evaluate and manage potential risks associated with the sourcing of biomass feedstock. Section 1 is supply-based definition and mapping. This component requires organizations to define and map their supply base, identifying the specific sources and locations of biomass feedstock. This helps establish a clear understanding of the scope and boundaries of the organization's sourcing activities. Section 2 is traceability to the supply base. Organizations must implement a traceability system that tracks biomass feedstock from supply base to the final product. This ensures accountability and transparency throughout the supply chain. Section 3 is a supply base evaluation. A thorough evaluation of the supply base is required to identify potential sustainability risks such as environmental, social, and legal concerns. This assessment helps organizations to make informed decisions about sourcing practices and risk management. Section 4 is supply base reporting. Organizations are expected to report on their supply base, including information about sourcing practices, risk assessment findings, and risk mitigation measures. This reporting demonstrates a commitment to transparency and responsible sourcing. Section 5, supply base verifiers. Independent verifiers are used to validate the accuracy and reliability of an organization's risk assessment and management efforts. These verifiers ensure that the organization's practices align with the Standard 2 requirements. Next section is Section 6. It's risk assessment. Organizations must conduct a comprehensive risk assessment to their supply base, evaluating the likelihood and impacts of potential sustainability risks. This process enables organizations to prioritize and address the most significant risks in their supply chain. There is an option to use an official SBP-endorsed RRA where available. Next is risk management. Based on the findings of the risk assessment, organizations must develop and implement a risk management plan to mitigate identified risks. This plan should include specific actions and measures to reduce the likelihood and impact of potential sustainability concerns. Next section is stakeholder engagement. Engaging with stakeholders is a crucial aspect of risk management. Organizations should actively involve relevant stakeholders in the risk assessment and management process, ensuring that diverse perspectives are considered and incorporated into decision-making. Annex 1 is about processing residues and post-consumer feedstock. This component addresses the specific requirements and considerations for organizations sourcing biomass from processing residues and post-consumer materials. In conclusion, SBP Standard 2 provides a comprehensive framework for organizations to effectively manage sustainability risks associated with biomass sourcing against the criteria in Standard 1. By following the standards requirements and implementing robust risk management practices, organizations can demonstrate their commitment to responsible biomass production and are allowed to make SBP compliant claims. Next, we will go through all the sections one by one, and I will provide comments and explanations where relevant. Section 1 is called Supply Base Definition and Mapping. Supply base remains the main concept of Standard 2. The supply base includes all relevant operators and stages within the biomass supply chain from the place of harvesting up to the organization's own operations. The sourcing area is a geographically defined area from which the forest biomass feedstock is sourced, from which reliable and independent information is available, and where conditions are sufficiently homogeneous to evaluate the risk of the sustainability and legality characteristics of the forest biomass. The area must encompass all places where feedstock was harvested from. A good practice is on a map to define the supply base area by geographical boundaries, including a description of where biomass originates if appropriate. A map is standard practice in the forest industry. For completeness, a map could be included in the supply base report. If not, then a map must be provided as evidence during the audit. More about the supply base report we will check later. The organization should start by identifying and listing the operations and operators involved in the various steps of the production, harvesting, and transport of feedstock. It must also identify whether the operator's actions can impact compliance with the requirements of this standard, but also Standard 1. If they do impact the compliance, the organization is required to include them in a listing as per this indicator. Collecting and recording the description can be done using spreadsheet, internal database, or third-party software, depending on the size of the operator and what is already in use. If supplier is certified against a recognized scheme, the organization must collect evidence of this certification. For example, screenshot of the scheme's website or copy of their certificate. Conventional COC practices require records to be kept for material input. In this case, it is recorded for all products as defined in Standard 4. We will cover these requirements in a separate module about Standard 4. Information for these requirements assist to better define the supply base and supply chain. The information will also be used when filling in the supply base report. Section 2 covers traceability requirements. Gaining access to relevant information about sources of origin and the supply chain is a key component of the procurement system and a prerequisite for implementing due diligence in the sourcing of the material. In other words, in order to evaluate and manage risks, we need to know the origin. If origin is not known, then the further steps of the DTS are not possible. Organizations shall ensure that all sourced feedstock can be traced back to a defined supply base. To do so, organizations shall ensure that the sourcing area is within the supply base. All information is collected to a level that enables identification of the origin of harvest, certification status, and further assessment of risks if applicable. Requirements 2.1 and 2.2 are relevant for primary and processing residues feedstocks only. Post-consumer feedstock is not required to be traced back to the supply base. See also Annex 1 in Standard 2 for requirements on post-consumer material, for example. We will cover them at the end of this module. Section 3 includes requirements for the supply base evaluation. It is very important to understand when supply base evaluation is applicable and which elements of the supply base shall be used. Supply base evaluation is a due diligence system which helps to identify, assess, and manage any risks to the requirements set in Standard 1 which are associated with the sourcing of feedstock. Standard 1 is, so to say, what to verify, and Standard 2 is how to verify. Organizations must review indicator 3.2 of Standard 2, a particular table which we see currently on the slide, to determine if they are required to complete or maintain the supply base evaluation or not, considering their feedstock type. The feedstock types are primary, processing residues, and/or post-consumer. Also considering the certification status, certified or non-certified, and if certified, whether that certification is benchmarked or recognized. In case of primary feedstock, the supply base evaluation is always required. However, sourcing primary feedstock with the claim of SBP benchmark scheme, for example FSC, may help to manage risks. Another important aspect is that there are two types of risk assessment. One is SBP endorsed regional risk assessment or RRA and company owned risk assessment. We will cover the difference in this next slides. For processing residues, the first step is to demonstrate that the feedstock really belongs to the processing residues category. Then it depends whether the feedstock is certified against one of the SBP recognized schemes, like FSC, or not. If it is certified, the feedstock is accepted as SBP compliant. If not, then it is required to implement the supply base evaluation in the same way as for primary feedstock. In case of post-consumer feedstock, biomass producers shall follow requirements from Annex 1 and demonstrate that feedstock belongs to post-consumer category. If this is the case, the feedstock may be considered SBP compliant. And finally, SBP recognizes FSC and PFC controlled system claims and allows to use such feedstock as SBP controlled biomass. Supply base evaluation is not required in this case. However, biomass producer may decide to still apply supply base evaluation if they want to demonstrate compliance with Standard 1 requirements and produce SBP compliant biomass. Just to repeat again, for primary feedstock, supply base evaluation is always required. FSC, PFC, or SFI certification may help to manage risks. There are two types of risk assessment: regional risk assessment and company's own risk assessment. Then for processing residues feedstock, one possibility is to source material with the SBP recognized certification claim, and that automatically turns it into SBP compliant. Otherwise, supply base evaluation is required. And for post-consumer material, everything is quite simple. All you need to do is to demonstrate that feedstock belongs to post-consumer category. So, let's assume that the supply base evaluation is necessary. Next, we will look at the components of the supply base evaluation and when do they apply. There are 5 elements: supply base verifiers, risk assessment, risk rating, risk management plan, and risk management measures. Supply base verifiers identify the information needed in the form of evidence or means of verification that are appropriate to the supply base and which allow the risks of the impacts identified in Standard 1 to be assessed. Supply base verifiers facilitate the assessment of the risks that organizations must manage in the context of their defined supply base. Risk assessment is the process of assessing the risk, and risk ratings are the outcomes of the risk assessments and can be low or specified. Risk management plan contains one or more risk management measures for specified risks. Looking at the table on the right, we see that when the SBP endorsed regional risk assessment is available in the country, for the sourcing area, there is no need to develop supply-based verifiers as well as assess the risk, as all of this is included in the official SBP endorsed regional risk assessment. Risk management plan and risk management measures are required to address specified risks when applicable. Next requirement is to establish subscopes. Subscopes are optional. They may be used when there are different characteristics in the supply base that indicate a non-homogeneous distribution of risks. Subscoping can apply to one or several indicators. Examples of variance within the supply base that may result in different risk conclusions due to different characteristics are the following. Jurisdictional. Different legislative and enforcement authorities apply across supply base. For example, countries, states, provinces, or counties. The ownership. Different legislative enforcement authorities tenure apply across ownership types. For example, public land or private land, smallholders versus extensive land ownership. Environmental. Different forest stands, habitat and ecosystem types, species composition, presence of high-value biodiversity, climatic and soil conditions. The social. Different resource use and access patterns, areas used by coherent communities, similar labor and employment regulations and patterns, operations impact on a single community, etc. Economic involves different management structures. Business structure is different requirements for operating a legal entity and implementation of management systems, for example, OSAs. Then certification type. Sourcing feedstock certified against an SBP benchmark scheme, for example, FSC or PSC. Then feedstock from non-forest land, trees outside the forest, like farmland, shelter belts, urban areas, road, rail side, plantings, and so on. It is recommended that subscopes should be identified at the beginning of each indicator findings against Standard 1, before information gathering for supply-based verifiers, risk assessment, and risk management. A single risk designation is required at the end of each indicator finding based on subscope. The use of subscopes will enable different risk mitigation measures to be put in place for different feedstock sources and risk profiles. Other requirements for supply-based evaluation include keeping it up to date, keeping records of any changes, review and revision every 5 years, and using competent personnel for doing supply-based evaluation. It is worth explaining when supply-based evaluation may need to be updated. If changes affect the risk assessment conclusions, the organization shall alter the required risk management plan of supply-based evaluation, which shall result in immediate review and, if deemed necessary, revision of supply-based evaluation by the organization. Such changes may include, but are not limited to, new legislation or jurisdictional changes, new feedstock sources being proposed, new suppliers and contractors being used, new sustainability issues relevant to the supply base, failure of any risk management measures within the risk management plan to address the specified risks. You can also refer to the guidance document as it provides more details on this topic. All indicators provided in Standard 1 feedstock compliance must have an individual risk rating. As we already know, in case of available SBP endorsed regional risk assessment, the biomass producer shall not conduct risk assessment itself. If this is not the case, then the biomass producer shall develop its own risk assessment. If the organization applies subscopes for any or all indicators, then each subscope must be evaluated independently and conclude with a single risk rating for each subscope for each indicator. There are only 2 risk ratings, low or specified. Low risk is concluded when sufficient controls or management systems are in place and the implementation of those controls or management systems provide verifiable positive result or current condition in terms of negligible severity or consequence. The specified risk, on the other hand, can result based on a number of scenarios considering the interaction between probability and severity. Any situation where there is a lack of controls or lack of management system and either no verifiable results with current condition or verifiable negative results and current condition in terms of severity, consequence, This will be the specified risk. When situations arise that are not definitely low risk or definitely specified, then the organization will need to consider scale and intensity before concluding. Organization could rationalize the risk designation during stakeholder engagement. Any risk that cannot be justified as low must be concluded as specified. Based on what we learned so far, the conditions for SBP compliant feedstock are the following. The results of risk assessment conclude low risk on all indicators, or the results of the risk assessment conclude specified risk and where the risk management measures have effectively reduced the risk specified to low risk, or where the processing residues feedstock is certified against SBP recognized certification schemes and the organization can demonstrate that the feedstock is indeed processing residues feedstock, or where the post-consumer feedstock is used and the organization can evidence the post-consumer feedstock category. Next section is about supply-based reporting. The supply-based reporting requirements are quite straightforward. Biomass producers shall use supply-based report provided in the SBP audit portal. So no simple separate Word or PDF templates anymore. All supply-based reports are developed directly in the audit portal. Supply-based report include following information: description of the company, scope description, supply-based description, quantification of the supply base, results of risk assessment, risk management plan, stakeholder engagement, and report authors and approval. The organization shall update its supply-based report at least annually. The organization shall make the supply-based report, including all the relevant annexes, available on request to stakeholders. Good practice is to provide the current supply-based report on the organization's website. Audit portal user guide provides detailed instructions on how to prepare the supply-based report. Section 5 provides further requirements for supply-based verifiers. We already know that supply-based verifiers are needed when there is no regional risk assessment available and biomass producer needs to do its own risk assessment. For each indicator in the SBP Standard 1, the organization shall identify and maintain a list of supply-based verifiers that cover the following points. First, the organization shall identify all applicable laws within the supply base that cover the indicators of Standard 1. So, answer to the question, do laws exist and cover the indicator? Second is the organization shall determine supply-based verifiers to evaluate whether these laws are actually enforced. So, enforcement by authorities through inspections, audits, monitoring. Next one is organization shall determine supply-based verifiers to evaluate whether the laws are actually implemented by the operators. So do operators follow the laws? So what is the actual reality? And finally, the organization shall determine supply-based verifiers to evaluate whether operators within the supply base are implementing best practices that demonstrably address the indicators of supply-based requirements in Standard 1. So sometimes there may not be the specific law, but the best practice, and this may be implemented. Next section, section 6, covers the risk assessment. The biomass producer has identified supply-based verifiers and now it needs to carry out the actual risk assessment. Biomass producer shall conduct risk assessment to determine if there is risk that the feedstock sourced is not in conformance with the Standard 1 requirements using identified supply-based verifiers. It shall include all operators involved in the production, harvesting and transport of feedstock within its supply base and having an impact on the conformance with the SBP standards and its risk assessment. The risk assessment conducted for each indicator and results in risk rating as specified or low risk. The organization may only conclude low risk if legislation exists and it is enforced to address the requirements in Standard 1, and operators are demonstrating legal compliance with the supply base, or in the absence of relevant legislation or lack of legal enforcement, by assessing whether relevant operators are implementing best practice designed to meet the requirements of Standard 1. The guidance document provides a very useful risk evaluation framework decision tree. Let's take a closer look. At each decision segment, if the answers are no, then it means that there is a so-called gap. A gap means that the risk is specified, or the organization must review and answer the next decision segment. If a specified risk is identified, the organization has the following options: provide verifiable evidence demonstrating local current conditions and its conformance, or implement mitigation measures. Last option always is to avoid the sourcing of this feedstock. Please go to the guidance document for more information on this risk evaluation framework. If any specified risks have been identified, these risks need to be managed. This is described in the section 7. It requires development of so-called risk management plan, which includes a set of measures to manage the specified risk. Risk management is an opportunity for the organization to reduce the risk to level low through implementation of risk management measures, or RMMs. It applies when an indicator is rated as specified in the organization's risk assessment or in SBP endorsed regional risk assessment, or RRA. The course of action taken to mitigate risks depends on the type and severity of the risk identified during the risk assessment process. If the risk assessment determines the risk designation as anything except low risk, the biomass producer is required to implement risk mitigation as described below. So first, identify and implement relevant mitigation measures aimed at lowering the risk associated with feedstock sourced. RMMs shall be justified and documented, with records of implementation maintained. A risk management plan shall be signed off by senior management in the organization. Then regularly monitoring of the implementation of mitigation measures shall be in place to ensure their efficiency. Organization shall monitor the effectiveness of its risk management measures at least every 12 months, but in any case prior to its annual audit. Alternatively, if negative harm cannot be avoided, feedstock must be excluded from the supply chain. Ineffectiveness of risk mitigation measures shall result in losing SBP compliant status of feedstock. Refusal to submit relevant records by suppliers and to apply the risk management measures shall result in losing SBP compliance status of the feedstock. So, in short, if risk cannot be managed, mitigated, brought to low level, or if there is evidence that risk management measures are not effective, then the status as SBP compliant will be lost. Last section of the Standard 2 talks about stakeholder engagement. I will cover the key points here. Before finalizing the supply base evaluation, or when an organization updates the supply base evaluation, it needs to engage with stakeholders with the specific intention of seeking feedback on its supply base evaluation, including supply base verifiers, risk assessment and risk ratings, and risk management plan, including risk management measures and means to verify the effectiveness of these risk management measures. It is considered best practice to proactively seek information, particularly on essential topics and from all the key stakeholders. Each time organization revises its supplier base evaluation, it is crucial to actively engage with stakeholders. This process aims to address their concerns through achieving a consensus, though achieving the consensus is not a requirement. In any case, the stakeholder engagement process needs to be documented. To ensure the meaningful dialogue, organizations should allow stakeholders at least 1 month to provide feedback. In addition, it is essential to provide adequate information to facilitate well-informed decisions. After the consultation period, organizations are expected to provide stakeholders with feedback on their comments and share the revised supply base report. The final published supply base report should include a description of the stakeholder engagement process, showcasing the organization's commitment to open communication and collaboration. The last slide of this training model is to cover Annex 1. The objective is that the biomass producer has to demonstrate that the feedstock is eligible for special requirements. For processing residues feedstock, SBP recognizes some of the certification schemes like FSC and PFC. For post-consumer feedstock, SBP recognizes it as SBP compliant directly. In both cases, it is essential to provide the credible evidence that allows to do this categorization. There are several steps that biomass producer needs to take to demonstrate compliance. The verification procedure could comprise an onboarding process. For example, new suppliers of processing residues or post-consumer feedstock could be informed of the requirements and complete surveys or declaration to provide information on their operations, sourcing practices, certifications, etc. The service should be updated every year. Based on the information provided in the supplier declaration, the organization can determine whether risk of the supplier delivering non-compliant feedstock is present and the appropriate level of monitoring and/or control measures for each supplier. Next step is the visual inspection upon receipt. Evidence can include feedstock delivery receipts and confirmation that staff are adequately trained to visually inspect feedstock upon receipt. If the results of the visual inspection determine that there is a risk of the supplier delivering non-conforming product, additional monitoring or control measures and documentation may be necessary. This may include quality lab testing or other practices as deemed appropriate. If steps described so far were not sufficient, additional monitoring measures should include annual or more frequent on-site supplier audits. The biomass producer may contact another external suitably qualified party to operate the supplier audit. In cases where the supplier selected for sampling sells processing residues or post-consumer feedstock that were previously collected, classified, and traded by other companies or sites, the complete supply chain of this feedstock shall be audited back to the point where the categorization as processing residues or post-consumer feedstock can be demonstrated through objective evidence. The organization should maintain records of supplier audits, including record of audit date, findings, names, and qualifications of auditors, and examples of evidence concerning categorization of feedstock so they can be provided to their CB during the annual audit. We reached the end of this module. Thank you for watching it. I hope it provided you sufficient knowledge to work with the Standard 2 version 2. If you have any questions, please contact the Secretariat or SBP technical team specifically.